Going way back in time, thousands of years, actually, to see what ancient Sanskrit texts can teach us about something we use every single day, language and meaning.
The Atharva Veda, one of the four Vedas, right? Those ancient collections of sacred texts from India.
Exactly. Think of them as a window into the minds of these ancient thinkers, their beliefs, rituals, their entire understanding of the world.
A window into another world. I love it.
Okay, so mission for today. What can these ancient Sanskrit texts tell us about the nature of languages is, how we interpret meaning, and are those things even relevant to us today?
That's the big question, isn't it? And one of the first things that jumped out at me from the book was this emphasis on going beyond just the literal meaning of words.
Oh yeah, the introduction even warns us, doesn't it? It says, in translating the Vedas, only literal meaning is just not sufficient. Sometimes it may create confusion and contradiction.
Like a warning to the reader, look deeper.
Exactly. And they give a really good example, too. There's this passage about waters and herbs being friendly or enemies, from the Atharva Veda.
Okay, now that sounds intense, right? Like straight out of a spell book or something.
Right. But then the translator explains it's not about wishing harm on anyone. It's more about understanding the body's natural defenses.
So friendly waters and herbs would be things that promote health.
Yeah. And enemies would be, stuff that makes you sick.
Interesting. So it's more about the effect on the body.
Yeah, it's like saying your immune system is friendly to your health. It's not literal, but it gets the point across.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the takeaway here? How should we be approaching text in general?
Well, I think it really highlights the importance of context, right? And nuance.
Absolutely. We can't just take words at face value, especially when we're dealing with texts from another time and culture.
Right, like, think about it like that game of telephone.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Where the message gets distorted as it's passed along. Now imagine that game played across thousands of years.
Yeah, that's a lot of potential for misinterpretation. And that actually brings us to the whole challenge of dating ancient texts.
Oh, yeah, right. The book even mentions Max Muller, that famous scholar who spent a huge chunk of his life studying the Vedas.
I remember reading about him. Dating these texts is a really tricky process, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And Muller himself was super skeptical about their age, at least at first.
Yeah, he went in with a lot of assumptions, didn't he?
He did. The book actually says his initial goal was to uproot Indian religion, but then he got completely fascinated by the Vedas. He even got impressed by Swami Dayananda's claims that the Vedas alluded to modern scientific inventions.
Seriously, so even a scholar who started out skeptical.
He got pulled in by the mystery and the depth of these texts.
That's amazing. It makes you wonder about our own assumptions, right? Like, do our beliefs and biases shape how we interpret things?
Totally. And that's where things start to get really interesting for me. Because the book discusses this concept of dhatu, the root of a word in Sanskrit.
Tatu, right? Like the seed of a word.
Exactly. And apparently the ancient thinkers believed that the structure of Sanskrit actually mirrored the structure of reality itself.
Whoa, hold on. So they thought their language reflected how the universe was organized.
That's what it seems like. It's almost like a physics equation or the periodic table, how we try to capture the fundamental order of the universe.
But they were doing it with language.
It seems that way.
That's a powerful idea.
Right. Maybe we're not so different from those ancient thinkers after all.
I like that. And speaking of connecting back to our world, there's this other point the book brings up about Colonel Bowden.
Colonel Bowden, who was he again?
He was the guy who funded the Bowden Chair at Oxford. And his whole intention was to promote translating the Bible into Sanskrit to help convert Indians to Christianity.
Oh, wow. Okay, so the translation itself had an agenda behind it.
Exactly. And it makes you realize how much a translator's own background and motivations can shape how they interpret and present material.
So it's not just about the words on the page. It's about the invisible forces that shape them.
Exactly. And as readers, listeners, we have to be aware of that.
Yeah, it adds a whole other layer of complexity.
It does. All right. Are you ready to jump into some specific examples from the Atharva Veda itself?
Let's do it. I'm ready to see how these ideas actually play out in the text.
Okay, well, one verse that stood out to me was, hold on, let me find it. Yes. Sumitriyan apa oshatayazantu. Ajud 36:23.
Oh, that's the one about the friendly and enemy waters and herbs, right?
That's the one. And remember how the translator went out of their way to clarify that it wasn't about harming enemies.
Yeah, it was more about ensuring good health and the body's ability to defend itself.
Exactly. It shows how a skilled translator can really bridge those massive gaps in time and culture, bring those subtle shades of meaning to life.
Absolutely. Okay, you ready for a verse that might make you chuckle a little?
Hit me with it.
Okay, so this one compares a bride to Yama, her husband to lead her home.
Okay. Yama, isn't that like the god of death in Hindu mythology? Sounds a bit ominous for a wedding.
It does, but remember, we have to consider the cultural context.
Right, right. Different time, different place.
Exactly. So in this case, it probably signifies the bride leaving her old life behind and entering this new chapter under her husband's guidance.
Okay, so not about death literally, but maybe a symbolic death of the old self.
Yeah, exactly. And it just shows how even seemingly simple concepts like marriage can have vastly different meanings depending on the culture, on the time period.
Absolutely. It's all about perspective, isn't it?
It really is. Speaking of different worldviews, there's this other passage that describes the human body as an abode of divinities.
Oh, I remember that one. It says that Agni, the god of fire, resides in vital heat, Vayu, the god of wind, in breath, and so on.
Isn't that beautiful? It's like they saw the divine in every aspect of human existence.
It's poetic and profound all at the same time.
I know, right? Okay, one thing that totally fascinated me was the mention of specific herbs, like Prishnaparni and apple marga.
Oh, yeah, and they talk about their healing properties too, right?
Right, the Atharva Veda has this whole wealth of knowledge about traditional medicine.
It's amazing what they knew back then. But we should be careful about taking those ancient remedies at face value, right?
Oh, absolutely. Modern science has come a long way since then.
For sure. But it is fascinating to see how humans have always been searching for ways to heal and understand the world around them through language, through ritual, through observation.
It's all connected, isn't it? It's like these texts, even though they're thousands of years old, can still teach us so much about language, culture, and just the basic human desire to understand the world.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover as we continue this deep dive into the Atharva Veda.
Okay, I'm ready to keep digging. What else have you unearthed in these ancient texts? All right, lay it on me. What other intriguing stuff have you found?
Well, there's this one second that talks about a whole bunch of curses and negative pronouncements, directed at enemies.
Curses. Whoa, okay. That's a little darker than what we've been talking about so far.
It is a bit of a shift in tone, isn't it? But I think we have to remember the historical context.
Right, right. Different times.
Exactly. This was a society where conflict and rivalry were pretty harsh realities.
So these curses were kind of a reflection of the dangers and anxieties of their world.
I think so. There are verses that call for the destruction of enemies, weakening their forces, even wishing for their downfall. The language is intense.
Yeah, I can imagine. It definitely sounds harsh to modern ears. But I guess it makes sense considering the world they lived in. It's like a window into their fears and desires.
It is, and it reminds us not to judge the past by today's standards.
Totally. Oh, what about the parts where they talk about using herbs to counter curses and poisons? It's like ancient magical warfare.
Right. It's fascinating. I think it speaks to this belief in the power of words and rituals.
Like language itself was a weapon.
In a way, yeah, the Atharva Veda sees language as this force that can both harm and heal, curse and protect.
That's powerful. Okay, I got to ask about this one verse that mentions a jewel called Jangita. Apparently, it can protect against all sorts of diseases, like Jamba and Vishkanda. Any idea what those are?
Ha! I wish. Those specific terms, I think you're kind of lost to time. But it shows that fascination with precious stones and their healing powers.
Yeah, like how some people today believe in the power of crystals.
Right. It's that same human search for ways to ward off bad stuff, whether it's through medicine, rituals, whatever works.
Okay, amidst all these curses and remedies, there's this passage about consensus and consent that I found really interesting. It talks about anumati, which is like the spirit of unity.
I think I remember that one, and they talk about bringing agreements to the divinities of nature.
Right, so even in this text, it's about conflict and survival. There's this recognition of the need for cooperation and harmony, like with each other and with the natural world.
I love that. It's like they understood that true strength comes from working together, not just dominating others.
Absolutely. Okay, on to a topic that always fascinates me. Marriage. We talked about this first earlier, but it bears repeating. The one that compares a bride to, well, Yama, with her husband leading her home.
Yeah, the god of death analogy is still a bit jarring.
I know, but you explained it so well before about how it's probably more about the bride leaving her old life behind and entering a new phase.
Exactly. It highlights how different cultures viewed marriage.
Yeah, our language and understanding of marriage have definitely changed a lot since then. Okay, here's one that's sure to get people thinking. The text talks about the importance of the Brahmana. Like, they're described as the sustainers of wisdom and values.
The Brahmana, they were like the scholars, the spiritual leaders in ancient India.
And the text warns against doing anything to harm them.
It's interesting, right? It makes you think about how we value intellectual and spiritual leadership today.
Yeah, good point. Like, do we have modern-day equivalents of the Brahmana? And are we doing enough to protect their voices? Something to ponder, for sure.
For sure. And here's another one about the importance of Rashtra.
Rashtra.
It's often translated as nation or kingdom, and the text calls for its strengthening and prosperity.
So even back then, the concept of national identity was important.
It seems so. There's even talk about strategic warfare and conquering enemies.
It shows that these challenges of governance and national security, they're not new at all.
Nope, humanity has been grappling with these things for a long time. Okay, now you got to tell me about this passage about the 9 pranic energies. I think they're associated with different metals like gold, silver, and iron.
Pranic energies. Okay, I'm going to need some help with that one.
So in ancient Indian thought, pranas were these subtle life forces that flow through the body. And connecting them to metals suggests the belief in the inherent energy of living beings and the natural world.
Interesting. It's like an early version of our ideas about energy fields and how everything is interconnected.
Right. It's amazing how these ancient concepts keep popping up in modern contexts. Okay, last one for now. The text describes a ritual where they invoke all these deities, like Agni and Soma.
Oh, for protection and guidance.
Exactly. It's like a prayer for success, both personally and for the community.
So even in this text that deals with pretty worldly stuff like warfare, there's still this yearning for spiritual connection.
I think so. It shows how the material and spiritual sides of life were intertwined for them. This deep dive has already given us so much to think about. It's amazing how the Atharva Veda, even though it's from a completely different time and culture, can still speak to us today.
Absolutely. It's been a wild ride so far, but I have a feeling you have one last insight to share that really brings it all home. Okay, you're right. I can feel it. What is it?
Well, it goes back to that idea we were talking about earlier, that the structure of Sanskrit, it actually mirrors the structure of reality.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild thought, isn't it?
It is. Like, imagine if our language actually reflected a deeper truth about the universe.
So if language can shape our perception of reality, what does that mean for us today?
Ooh, that's a big one. Like, does the structure of English, does that limit our understanding of the world? Or does it expand it? Do the words we use actually influence how we see ourselves and everything around us?
It's almost like language becomes this lens we see everything through.
Exactly. And that lens, it can either clarify things or it can distort things. We have to be aware of that.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey, hasn't it? From ancient Sanskrit texts to how we communicate today.
And I hope it's given our listeners some new things to think about the words they use and the stories they tell.
Absolutely. We've covered so much ground today, haven't we? Curses, remedies, the structure of reality, the power of ritual, even the divine spark within each of us.
We've really seen how language can be such a powerful force, for good or for bad. It can shape our beliefs, our actions, and it can connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to ponder.
All right, hit us with it.
If language is a tool for understanding reality, as the Atharva Veda seems to suggest, how can we use it more consciously, more responsibly in our own lives?
Such a great question to end on. It challenges us to really think about the impact of our words, to choose them carefully, to use them to create a world that reflects the wisdom and beauty we've glimpsed in these ancient texts.
Think about the words you choose, the stories you tell. How do they affect the people around you? Do they promote understanding, empathy, connection?
Powerful stuff. It's really all about using this amazing gift of language to make the world a better place.
This has been a truly fascinating exploration, and I'm so thankful to have shared it with you and all of our listeners.
Me too. Until next time, everyone, happy deep diving.